Okay, I am now recording this through Camtasia on my computer, so it's kind of like a little bit sneaky to do it that way, but I promise to share it afterwards. So let's move forward and also move forward without the screen share, which is fine. Starting with Dr. April Bleske-Rechek. Her study was published 2014 and was one of the central, like I said, citations, references that I referred to as I was going through the literature. And so her study was titled Trends in GRE Scores and Graduate Enrollments by Gender and Ethnicity. And there were a lot of statistics in there. So I'm going to let her introduce that in a second. Dr. Lucina Uddin, meanwhile, published in Nature Neuroscience. This was 2021, so very recent. And the title of her study was Revising Evaluation Metrics for Graduate Admissions and Faculty Advancement to Dismantle Privilege. So some important discussions that we've been delaying too long before getting into. So I'm going to turn it over to April to introduce her work. And we'll start with her, and then we'll turn it over to Lucina and her colleague Daniel. So April, take it away.
These arguments not convincing. So I put it out there, I'm a proponent of the continued use of the GRE exams in graduate admissions. So there are 4 arguments. The first one I think is the longest one, so I'll try to be quick, reasonably quick here. But the most common argument against the GRE that I have heard is that it is biased. And to be blunt, this claim is false. It contradicts extensive reports on the statistical validity of the GRE. And I presume that people who suggest the GRE is biased are operating with a non-statistical definition of validity, such that in their mind, a test is not valid if the consequences of using the test do not match their idea of what is morally right. As Lise Haley noted back in 1996, this is a dangerous intrusion of politics into science. He wrote, quote, evaluating the validity of measurements on the basis of positive or negative social consequences encourages a confusion of fact with the preferences and wishes of specific people, unquote. So what are the facts? The facts are recurring, and they are that groups of people, as defined by self-identified gender or race and ethnicity, score differently on the GRE. For example, on the quantitative section, a typical male test taker scores 1/2 of a standard deviation higher than the typical female. Meanwhile, on that same quantitative section, Asian test takers score, on average, a 1/2 standard deviation higher than white test takers. And on both sections, white test takers have mean scores about 1 standard deviation higher than those of Black test takers. Some of these group differences in score distributions are for sure discouraging, and their existence has consequences. But in and of themselves, group differences in score distributions do not equate to test bias. A bathroom scale that reveals that the women in the house tend to weigh less than the men in the house is not an indication that the scale is biased. To equate difference with bias is a basic and egregious conflation of correlation with causation, as all of us in psychology know very well. The existence of a group difference does not explain its causes. In fact, the literature on predictive validity is quite clear that the GRE is not biased. A specific score on the GRE is just as predictive of success in graduate school for members of one group as for another. There may be fewer Black test takers than Asian test takers scoring above 160 on the GRE verbal, but regardless of their group membership, scoring above 160 is associated with a higher than average likelihood of succeeding in graduate school. The numbers on the predictive validity of the GRE have been analyzed and reported on extensively by scholars like Nate Kunzel at the University of Minnesota, psychometricians at ETS. There's a great report on psychology graduate program students, 1,500 students out of ETS. Those with GRE scores in the top third of the sample were 3 times as likely, twice as likely to have first-year GPAs in the top quartile, 3 times less likely to have GPAs in the bottom quartile. These links are really impressive, by the way, because there's massive restricted range. They used only students who were admitted to the programs. And of course, GPAs in graduate school, as we all know, tend to range only from 3.0 to 4.0. Second argument that I have heard is that the GRE is biased towards students from higher social classes. And I think this is true that students from higher social classes do tend to do better on the GRE, but again, that doesn't mean that the GRE is biased. Whatever your socioeconomic status is, doing well on the GRE is positively associated with favorable outcomes. Moreover, once you partial out the statistical variance that is shared between social class and GRE scores, GRE scores continue to predict success in graduate school. Notably, as reviewed by Sackett and colleagues, the typical effect of coaching on the GRE, which higher social class test takers are more likely to do and pay for, is small, and it's equivalent to what disciplined test takers can do for themselves with a book of GRE practice tests obtained from their local library. And I have to mention what seems to be a well-kept secret, which is that standardized tests like the GRE are an efficient and powerful way for programs to discover talented students who would not otherwise come to their attention. As any national talent search director will tell you, standardized tests have long been relied on to find talent in remote places, and the GRE is no exception. Third, some scholars have suggested that the GRE has more limited predictive validity than originally documented. The weight of the evidence suggests that this statement is false as well. It's easy to find a single study to cite that finds a small effect, and it's easy to find a single study that showed a large effect. The question is what is going on in the aggregate, and the meta-analyses are very clear that the GRE is a positive predictor not only of first-year graduate GPA, but also of cumulative graduate GPA, faculty ratings, degree completion, and qualifying exam scores. The typical predictive association of the GRE with these outcomes is moderate, and some people have misleadingly interpreted that as not strong enough. But those critics fail to offer an alternative with comparative predictive validity. When someone asks, how does the GRE fare in predicting graduate school outcomes? I think they should instead consider the question, how does the GRE fare compared to something else? Because the answer is that it is better than the alternatives, perhaps with the exception to undergraduate GPA. To recommend holistic review without specifying exactly what that entails is to leave admissions committees at the mercy of subjective and biased decision-making. I would highly recommend Daniel Kahneman's newest book, Noise, for anybody who questions the value of objective over subjective decision-making. A meta-analytic review by Sarah Murphy and colleagues has found that some popular admissions materials, specifically personal statements, show far weaker predictive validity compared to the GRE, and when the GRE is included alongside personal statements, offer no additional validity. And finally, I have heard people suggest that dropping the GRE will help universities meet their desire to recruit applicants from historically minoritized groups. It's not clear that removing the GRE will resolve this problem. The issue is the validity diversity paradox. The challenge is to find measures that, one, show minimal group differences, and two, are simultaneously valid, meaning accurate and unbiased tools to predict success in graduate school. Undergraduate GPA suffers from the same group disparities as do GRE scores. As already noted, personal statements show trivial to weak validity. Moreover, personal statements are subject to other biases of social class because people of higher social class can pay somebody to write their statement for them. Personal statements and letters of recommendation both are subject to biases on behalf of committee members who read them. In fact, little is known about the degree to which individuals who read these materials show consensus in their evaluations. The bottom line is that, in my mind, there is not solid evidence that tools other than the GRE are going to be simultaneously free of group differences in performance and simultaneously valid predictors of school outcomes. I would argue that it's time to stop shooting the messenger, the GRE, that reveals distributional differences in these skills, and instead it's time to start developing effective ways for ameliorating skill gaps.
All right. Well, thank you, April, for the introduction. I wanted to give, well, you guys can decide. Daniel, Lucina, one of you guys can go next and introduce yourselves and perhaps also introduce your views or your research on the topic, or both.
Sure. Hi, I'm Lucina Uddin, and actually I don't do research on GREs and test taking. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and I've just become involved in this discussion more recently through some diversity and equity committees that I've been involved in over the last few years. And of course, every university this past couple of years has had to make the decision about whether or not to use GREs for admissions based on COVID, rather than based on any other consideration. So as anyone can see, most universities have opted to either drop entirely or make the test optional. And the rationale there was that we couldn't get to testing centers, et cetera. So, this was a temporary solution. So now the question is, we're 2 years into this pandemic. Do we go back to, the way we've always done things, or do we move forward with a new, new set of criteria and new ways of evaluating students and whether they're prepared to enter a graduate program? So I've actually, want to leave the comments regarding, the statistical sort of aspects and the, predictive capacity of the GRE. I'm going to leave that to my colleague, Daniel Bradford. But I just wanted to bring to our attention some of the realities of taking the GRE, right? When we say, okay, well, you have to take this test in order to submit an application to our program. What that means is that we're asking students to take something that costs about $200 or so, and to take it, at their discretion as many times as they want. So I'm guessing an average student might take it twice to see how well they do. So that's already sort of a $400 commitment. Something I didn't realize until recently was that if you were asking students international students in other countries to take the GRE, the cost can vary a lot more, a little bit more than $200 or $300. But what we think of as Americans as a small price to pay can really be a huge burden on people from Nigeria, for example, where the test costs $226 to take. So there's some financial considerations that I think we have to go broader than just the Americas to keep in mind. But on top of that, of course, is the fact that it costs $20-some to send the scores once you've taken them to each school. So we're talking, let's say, average of 6 schools. We send it out, you're about $150 or so right there. So it's not cheap, right? What the things we're asking these students to do are, at minimal, going to cost them $500 or so. That and people will say, well, there's programs to waive the fees, but as far as I can tell, they're not sort of uniform. It's not always clear where you can apply to these, whether you'll be approved before the cycle begins. It's not sort of just you'll ask and you'll receive. So there are some financial barriers that I think just are worth mentioning. And then when you get to the test prep, it is true that you can prepare yourself. It's true that there's free programs. It's true that there's some test preps that are about $100 and are very effective. It's also true that Princeton Review charges $2,000 for their test prep and guarantees minimal scores. So there is the, fact of the matter is, and, as small as the test prep course is in terms of its, changing of the end result, if it wasn't effective, nobody would be paying $2,000 for it. And I assume we can all guess who is paying the $2,000 and who is sort of left out of that equation. So there are some financial, considerations that I think get kind of pushed to the side. We can look at the statistics of, what the GRE predicts, but there's a lot of other confounds in those numbers that I'm sure Daniel will get to. But I'm just bringing this all up because the final thing is that schools then see the scores that you submit. What they see is the scores. They don't know how many times you've taken it. You're allowed to take it 5 times a year. They don't know anything about the test prep that was made available to you, and the finances that you or your family put forward to achieve that score. It's basically just a number that the schools then see and do what they like with it. So it's what I think at the end of the day, I mean, it may be a useful tool for screening applicants, but at the same time, until we know what kind of test prep was taken, how many times the student took the test, whether or not they had the opportunity to avail themselves of a $2,000 test prep course. All of these factors, I think, that are not reported alongside the final score are they're clearly affecting the outcome, and they're affecting who we in turn then admit into the programs, especially if we use minimum cutoff scores for the GRE as many graduate programs have in the past. I'm not sure what all the schools do, but the ones that I've surveyed did have sort of minimum cutoffs. And so the question is, do we care that this is going to, automatically rule out a large swath of individuals who just can't put the money forward, to achieve this? So I'm not doing research on this topic. It has become, a consuming topic for me over the last year or so, but I just wanted us to, keep in mind some of these financial constraints as we're going forward. And I'm happy to keep this short in the spirit of discussion and hand it over to Dan.
Thanks, Lucina. You may be wondering why I'm here. I haven't even written anything like these two people have about it publicly. I think I'm here more because in more small circles, I've probably been loud enough to make people sort of ask me about my opinions on it. My research is essentially the psychophysiological determinants of things like stress and anxiety in relation to addiction. So still far from actual research on this stuff. I do have a part of my research that takes kind of a empirical refinement of methods and sort of a psychometric approach to some of these things that I use. And that's where the kind of gateway into the GRE stuff sort of started for me. I teach graduate statistics and all that, so I'm heavily involved in statistics. And there's certain things that come up in this debate that I think is easy to miss, and we're not going to resolve, frankly, a lot of them in this call because you can't really do that over Zoom. We can start sharing our screens and pointing at tables and things like that, and that's not going to be super effective. But I will make some more sort of broad statements, as it seems like the theme we're doing is kind of opening with broad statements, and then we can all discuss. So one thing that I think is worth noting is that I think there are people who say and believe that the GRE test itself is biased. And I don't think I'm one of those people. I don't think the GRE test itself is biased necessarily from a psychometric perspective, et cetera. But I think that people say the test is biased, and what they mean is the test is used in a biased way, or the use of the test itself is biased. And those are different things which we can try to unpack a bit as we discuss, rather than me try to do it right now. But there's differences between those things, and I think it's important to keep that in mind, what people really mean when they say it's biased, because just like anything else in all of our constructs, particularly in fields like psychology, some of the language can get kind of blurry, and that can really affect the robustness of the debate. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing I'll note is part of the reason why I kind of got drawn towards this and started to be involved in these discussions more is just a couple broad statements about the statistics stuff involved. So basically, there are correlations that come out, and I'll just say up front, I do not question whatsoever that the GRE is a quote unquote significant predictor of some things. And by significant, what we really mean is it's different than zero. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way towards the GRE. I'm just saying that's what it means with something statistically significant, usually with the way we do null hypothesis testing. We're saying it's a better predictor than nothing for some certain things. It's important to keep in mind as we discuss this that what those certain things are and what certain things we care about. There's been some people that say, well, it only predicts your first year graduate school GPA. And I don't think that's true. I think I know it predicts other things as well, but it may most robustly predict that. Better than zero, for sure. Or it may predict that better than zero. And then there's sort of the size of the effect. And I think the effect size part becomes very important when we start to do what essentially is what we're all doing, is not asking, does the GRE work in some way? We're asking to do a cost-benefit analysis. And should we use it and is it worth it? And that's where I think the effect size of these things, like how strong are the correlations, is important to consider. In some cases, we might think they're strong, but we have to think about what does it mean to consistently see a correlation of 0.3. A lot of people, particularly statisticians, will say, wow, it's consistently 0.3 and it's a p-value less than 0.05. That's great. And some other people may say, well, I don't know if that translates into the costs that are associated both financially and from an equity perspective, et cetera. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind as well. The other thing that I think is interesting that comes up is we talk a lot about the predictive nature and all the correlations that are positive. But one thing we never, for some reason, people don't ever point out that from ETS's own research, which they're very big and seems to be well-conducted studies. You look at the tables, and the GRE negatively correlates for like the quantitative part will negatively correlate with life sciences achievements. And so it basically, you want people who do, like if you go from that logic, you want people who do worse on the quantitative part of the GRE in your program because it negatively correlates. Those are often sort of waved away all the times it doesn't work. And that is, essentially a problem we have in all research, and particularly in psychology, of a kind of, it's almost like a file drawer problem, or kind of a, trying to think of other words for it, but we just don't talk about the fact that it went in the other direction for some things. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. And we have to think about, what does that mean? Because if I'm in the life sciences, maybe it needs to be by the program. Maybe the life science doesn't want to use it. Maybe psychology does for some reason, but it should be a cost-benefit analysis, and we should be clear about the robustness for individual predictors and for different subjects themselves. And then the final thing I'll just react to, and then we can have maybe a more broad discussion, is I think Lucina brought up a interesting point about the coaching effect, because it is said, particularly by proponents for keeping the GRE, that that you can't really improve your score a ton from coaching. But then a lot of proponents of GRE says, well, we'll make the coaching programs cheaper so you can improve your scores. And you can't really have it both ways. I mean, they either work well enough to matter or they don't. And so that's something that I think probably needs to be resolved as well. So I will stop there. I tend to be very robust, to warn everyone, verbose. So go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I was looking at April there during the discussion. I feel like you might have some reactions to what was said, but also I just wanted to come back to, so reading through April's research, there's this data on, and so I stopped using the word bias, and thanks to April for that, actually, and a couple of others who corrected me on it, because bias refers to the content of the exam, and really what I'm referring to when I try to use the word bias is disparities, or the what you described, where on average males are outperforming females by a little bit. On average, white and Asians are outperforming other groups on the GRE sections. So I got to worrying about, like Lucina mentioned, the cutoff scores that get used a lot of times, because cutoff score, there's not necessarily cutoff scores for research experience or personal statements or things like that. But I feel like are more, correct me if I'm wrong, they're more often there for GRE scores. So then if there are these disparities and then a school uses a cutoff score, then I see that as problematic potentially, because folks that are victims of this disparity, or lower, at the low end of the disparity, are then getting cut off more often. And so they're not even being considered for grad school. But then if they can make that certain cutoff, then maybe they are okay, because then the admissions committee can see the GRE score, but then they weigh it against other things as well. So I guess maybe back to April for your thoughts on that and anything else that was said just now.
I'm having a really hard time hearing your volume specifically, Mark. So I hope I caught that. I didn't know if you wanted me to respond to
Was it a problem for
previous
well?
remarks, or do you want me to talk about cutoffs, or?
Yeah. Was my volume a problem for others as well?
Not me.
Okay. I took off my headphones and put my voice into the air, because that will then allow the recording to exist, as opposed to my headphones, which would block everyone's audio. So that's why I did that. But anyway, just the disparities, the fact that some schools use a cutoff score, which might affect folks that are, below that cutoff, and disproportionately affect certain groups. But also, you can feel free to react to what's been said otherwise so far.
Okay. Well, I guess, okay, I'll try to take this in order of when the thoughts occurred to me. One, Daniel, I had not heard that argument of like, well, we should just do more test prep. I hadn't heard that because I thought the data were very clear on test prep programs as really being marginally effective. And I do think it's false logic to think that these programs must be effective, otherwise people wouldn't use them. I mean, psychology is rife with demonstrating examples of people using things and spending a lot of money on things. Baby Mozart DVDs, DARE, self-esteem empowerment programs. We spend a lot of money on things that don't actually work. We do it with hopes that they will, or because, our personal experience, taking availability bias and confirmation bias at hand, we will think that something has worked for us. So I think the test prep arguments are difficult to deal with, and I would agree with you that I don't think that suggesting we can do test prep is going to resolve the problem. Especially given, Lucina's note that they're expensive, if that's a ridiculous option as well for that reason. And then I was just thinking about the cost benefit analysis you raised, and I think there's a reason we don't show scatter plots of 0.3 in newspaper articles. It's because there's a lot of noise. But when you are devoting a lot of money and time and effort into training, when you can do 60% versus 60-40 likelihood of being successful as opposed to a 50-50, I think a lot of programs would argue, especially companies who are trying to make money, or if you work at the Air Force Academy and you have to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in every student, that a correlation of 0.30 is quite important. In cutoff scores, I have to say I don't work at an R1 institution, and so I don't know much about what universities do for cutoff scores. If they have a low cutoff, if they recognize the likelihood that their applicants will differ, and they establish kind of ranges of cutoff scores, depending on whether it's the quant or the verbal, or depending upon if it's a certain group of applicants or another. I'm really not familiar with what various programs do, so I'd be curious to hear what happens at different universities.
So yeah, many universities either say explicitly on their application portals, or it's behind the scenes that they'll have a number in mind as a cutoff, and they'll use it as a sort of way to weed out the applicants, because you may, of course, get way many more applications, especially at the big R1s, than you're willing to look at. So a lot of universities do a first pass in that way. And in some cases, if asked about it, they'll say, well, we use that in combination with the entire package, but it's not always clear how that might be implemented. So there's the sort of danger of, if there is a score there and it falls, some hovering around a cutoff, then and we've seen, from the data you presented, that there are these male, female, and minority group differences already, then you're obviously going to, cut out those groups more often than not if cutoffs are used at all. So, I mean, I think what's been interesting this year, though, is that we've seen, I would say, the majority of universities just dropping the GRE entirely because of the COVID issues. So what we have now is a natural experiment to see what happened to admissions, what happened to, after, of course, long-term follow-up of the people who came in through these last cycles. Were they really so different than the ones before, because we didn't collect GRE, we didn't have the information beforehand. I think we've been operating from a lot of missing data, because the people who were cut off didn't make it into grad school, so we couldn't see if they were successful in grad school. It's a missing data point. We'll never know if they would have been successful in grad school. They never made it past the threshold. to give us a glimpse into what they were capable of. So a lot of these, as much as I didn't want to talk about statistics, we have missing data. That's a problem here. We can't impute that data. We never knew it. But yeah, so this natural experiment I'm very interested in, because I don't think schools are doing this, but what we really have to do is just start collecting the data immediately, to follow up long-term, success rates or whatever we want to measure, to see in this year where we have this vast experiment of no GRE scores to work with, what did schools do? I mean, the one thing that any director of any program will tell you is they got more applicants this year than ever before, right? There are more people who submitted an application to go to grad school. Dropping the GRE perhaps lowered some barriers for those individuals. I don't know why else we would have gotten more. But in any case, we got way more applications than ever before, and way more applications from minorities. Now, whether or not they would be successful, whether or not we know how they're going to turn out in 5-10 years, that's the sort of empirical question. But I think we have an opportunity here to do a lot of data collection.
And I just want to write on that just real quick, Lucina. And I think the data collection is incredibly important for many reasons. But one thing to note too is that, some people will talk about a scale of some sort being reliable, and they'll report the reliability that was reported from the validation of the scale. But psychometricians, a lot of people know that you should be reporting the reliability of the scale as you use it. Like, so if you use a measure in a study, you should report what your reliability was. Hopefully it's similar or better, or it might be a little worse. Hopefully it rides around there. But these correlations may vary so much by programs that, it's important for individual universities to know what's happening for the GRE for their individual programs. And we should be, if it saves us a lot of money, which is what's being suggested, we should be pretty motivated to find out how much. That's from the kind of the cold money perspective. Of course, I'm personally motivated to find out for equity reasons, but we should be looking at that. The other thing, just to respond to you, April, real quick about the test prep thing. What I was referring to, I don't hear that we should give them more test prep that often either, though I do hear some people say we should give free test prep. What I'm reacting to is the fact that the same the companies that say, like, they basically do a lot of work to validate things like the GRE are also selling thousands of dollars programs. And so that's the can't have it both ways thing. If you don't think it works, they could just be very unethical and just, whatever, but like, do we believe they're very unethical when they do the test prep selling, but they're totally ethical and trustable when they're doing validation studies? Like that's the part that doesn't really necessarily add up for me.
All right, so I wanted to move the discussion a little bit toward what should we do, because we have these different. And by the way, April, can you hear me? Am I okay? So there's pros and cons to the GRE. We could. I feel like we could discuss those a long time. There's also some things that I've looked at with regard to the content of the test. Sometimes for example, the geometry and the trigonometry and things that are part of that quantitative section are going to be more relevant for grad students in certain disciplines versus others. In psychology, I feel like some of it is going to be relevant, but I was looking through as a quantitative psychologist myself, looking through, and I was like, man, I forgot how to do the hypotenuse of a triangle or whatever. The stuff that's on there seems to be kind of unrelated, some of it to psychology students and what they need to know for being successful researchers in grad school. But that aside, what are our recommendations? Lucina has written about holistic admissions, and I'd like her to talk a little bit more about that. So maybe I'll start with her on this one, and then circle back through the panel one more time to see what you guys recommend. Should we keep the GRE dropped? Should we keep it in there, but maybe look at some other metrics that don't contain these disparities? I think that's what April was mentioning earlier. So, Lucina, you want to talk a little bit about your recommendations?
Sure. Yeah, this is the tough question. Is if we lose that, then what do we use? I was sort of more on the side of we don't really, want to keep it for, all the reasons that we've already talked about, but also just because I think we underestimate how much, international students are affected by the fact that we require this for graduate admissions. I think, because maybe just in the area that I'm in, we have a lot of international students, so I'm more sort of sensitive to it. But if we're getting rid of it, then it's of course much harder to look at the applications and evaluate, because we don't have the only numbers that we have then are GPAs, which are also hard to evaluate from international students. But, so we don't have as many numbers. So that's what makes us nervous. So then you have things like letters of recommendation, you have the research statement or the personal statement, and you have interviews, and everyone has talked a lot about how there's biases that creep in at every stage of these processes. So there's nothing we could do that would remove all of these sources of human, the way that humanity is. So there's no way to say like this person is going to do well in grad school that's completely free of sexism and racism and all the other isms. So given that's the case, I mean, we can't just give up, right? We have to sort of still do our best. And I think what holistic review means is taking into account, the entirety of that person's trajectory, where they are and where they've been. And I think you can get a lot more of that from letters of reference and from the personal statement and from, talking with the individual than you could from, just the GRE, which is the numbers. And the reason, but holistic reviews, when they've been implemented in, for example, like medical school or residency settings, there's been a couple articles that suggest that they, maintain the integrity of the admissions process while also increasing the diversity of the applicants. But it's more work, right? We'll have to do more kind of one-on-one. We might have to call up the references and talk to them and have a conversation. I mean, really, it will be on the admissions committee extra effort if we're going to do anything like a holistic review that gives us a full picture of the individual. And so that's why I think, as much as that would be the ideal, it's a practicality. Do we have time to spend 3 hours on an applicant if we have 1,000 applicants? I mean, that's a legitimate problem. We maybe don't have that many hours in the day. But I mean, if we replace the GRE with another test, we'll come up with reasons why we don't like that test either. Like anything we replace it with that's a stand. And I'm also like, just as a side note, just think about who profits from this. It's GRE, the test prep folks, the testing industry. It's capitalism. Like why do we just want to feed another beast? Like if we're trying to find out who will make the most productive scientists in the future, and all we're doing right now is like seeing who has the money to take the test multiple times or to figure out how the system works. I think it doesn't seem to me like we're doing the best job of like identifying the most promising individuals to contribute to science as an endeavor. So in any case, I don't know what we could actually do other than really embrace holistic review in all its complexity.
So I want to go to the other panelists on this topic. I'm seeing in the chat lots of reaction. I love it. This is why we're having this today, is so that people can share thoughts. I'm afraid that we might not be able to get to everyone because we're trying to end at 4 o'clock. Although I'm happy to try to go a little bit later. If the panelists are able. But anyway. What I'd like to do is, if you guys have questions that you'd like to ask and you don't mind sending them to me as a direct message in the chat, then I can kind of pick and choose from that list, and I can organize it that way as the moderator. And I wanted to get to that after the panel, the rest of the panel has a chance to comment on the question of what should we do. So Daniel or April on that topic.
Go ahead, April, if you want to.
Okay, well, I was like, you go. I totally resonate with what Lucina is saying about the practicalities and the difficulty of doing this well. And, I'm reminded of research that Paul Meehl brought to our attention years ago about clinical versus actuarial prediction. And the concern that I have is that, I think people want the decision to be a human decision. I think they worry that they will be the one who is overlooked on the basis of a test score. And I think that we tend to forget that bias can operate in all kinds of directions. And that when you have an individual making a decision, that they get pulled in by a specific piece of information. So we think that we are integrating multiple pieces of information. We think that we are weighting things appropriately in accord with an agreement we have as a committee member, right? That the committee members have agreed to what the standards are. But in fact, we fall prey to biases, and this has been documented again and again. Paul Neal wrote about it extensively. Renee Dawes wrote about it extensively. And like I mentioned, Daniel Kahneman most recently raised the issue again in Noise with Savoni and Sunstein. And so I just really worry about that. It's not unique to parole officers. It's not unique to clinical diagnosis. It happens in admissions. And I think we just want that decision to be human. And we forget that mechanical decisions can be really good. And I understand the fear of, this, feeding the capitalist beast, but at the same time, we are a market. And if we had another company come up with a good test that did not show group disparities, people would be on that like flies on butter, right? Like there is a market for that. People are trying. I'm pretty sure they're trying.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. My screen got a little weird. You were finished, April? Or no? Okay, great. So yeah, it's actually I'm glad you ended with that, because I mean, if we're okay with you, if there was a really good test that was come up with by the capitalist market, and we're okay with it, and I agree, if there was a great test that maybe it correlates by 0.5 on average and it doesn't show disparity, I agree, we would probably pay more for it than the GRE. I will say, and part of the answer to the question of what do we do now, I mean, I don't think any of us really know for sure, other than we have our opinions, our preferences. We keep the GRE, we use a different set of law. A couple things to point out. One is that, we're psychologists, we're supposed to be good at this. And so we probably could all, find ways to contribute to try to make help make a better test. And maybe it's a funding agencies. All this stuff is, I don't mean for it to sound kicking the can down the road, but it's probably going to take a while to make this better. But one way to put pressure on the capitalist market is to not use their product anymore. I guarantee you, if we all stopped using the GRE, which is, I know it's not going to happen right away, though it kind of sort of is getting forced that way. I'm assuming the GRE makers are probably going to come up with a test that shows less disparities for better or worse. And the reason why I say for better or worse is obviously it'd be great to have less disparities. But I don't know what that pressure would do to, I should have said, one of the things that I study is kind of, in some ways, research malpractice, I guess. And I'm suspicious in some ways of the testing companies. I'll just say full disclosure on a recorded call. I would be even more suspicious if they were scrambling to produce something that didn't show disparities. But that's the quickest way to do it. So right now, the choice point I think we're at is, yes, the GPA has bias as well. The interviews have bias. The holistic admission process will have bias. We also know you can't say that the GRE necessarily has bias, but the use of it is often biased. We stop using it, I bet the companies will come up with something different. We just have to wait a while. So that's just my opinion.
All right. Well, thanks to some of you guys for sending in your questions, and I'm like super interested to follow up with everyone who's here after the panel discussion here too, just because I've been just searching for people to talk to about this over the last couple of years. Pro and con and everything in between on the GRE. So I wanted to go first to my colleague Q, who had a couple of comments. So Q, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Mark, for putting this panel together. I see a lot of students on this panel, and I want to acknowledge that this is probably, hearing some of these things is probably kind of a little bit triggering for you and problematic for you. And so, and as a faculty member, I want to say that, you know, as I'm hearing some of these things, I think back to my time as a student. I couldn't afford to eat and had to save money for the GRE because I wanted to go to grad school. So I remember those decisions that I had to make, and a lot of my friends who are people of color who wanted to go to grad school had to make. And so, you know, just wanted to acknowledge that and put that out there. I think that this entire discussion is problematic for me for a few reasons. I think that we're skirting around the issue of racism and bias, and we're calling it like, why we're not calling it racist or biased when the ETS itself is has admitted to and has publicly said that there are consistent group differences based on race, ethnicity, economic status, and gender. But we're not supposed to call that bias. And they also say that this doesn't indicate bias in the test. It indicates bias in or differences in courses taken or experiences or kind of social historical conditions that prevent people from having equitable access. That is racism. That is racism. And for us to be sitting here talking about, let's not call it bias. I'm sorry, what?
Actually, I'm happy to call it racism.
What world are we living in when we know higher education is meant, it's not made for Black and brown bodies and indigenous bodies. They're not spaces made for certain people. The SATs and the GREs were designed to keep Black and brown kids out of white schools. And here we are saying in 2021 that none of this bias exists anymore. And if any group differences exist, they are, when April, when you said that if men and women in the household weigh differently, are we going to say the scale is biased? Are you telling me then that there are, the conclusion I come to is that you're trying to say that there are real intelligence or ability differences between groups of people on this test? Is that what you are willing to say? And we're not supposed to call this bias. I call BS on that. This entire discussion is about how we are. I'm sorry. I've got more
to say. To say that the differences exist does not say why the differences are there.
The ETS itself says that the differences exist partly because of inequitable access that led to them, right? The ETS itself is saying, hey, but don't worry, our test is not biased. It's just reflection of a biased society. So why are we making people pay hundreds of dollars for this? So if we really, really care about equity, right? If we really care about making higher education more accessible to people and so that it can uplift people and their families and their communities, we cannot talk about this test as if it is a racially bias-free, it's free of bias in terms of race, gender, economic status. We cannot do that. And when we do that, it's in itself is an act of collusion. It is racism. So I'd like to redirect the conversation, right, from is the ETS or is this test biased to we have seen these differences. They exist, small or big, they're still there, right? What are we going to do about this if we as an institution, as a department, want to recruit the most promising people, right? How are we going to do this without placing an undue burden and a disparate burden on some groups of people? That should be the question.
lots to think about, lots to consider. So I wanted to put it back to the panel and see if you guys wanted to react.
I mean, the whole reason I got dragged into this is because of racism, not because of I know anything about the GRE. I'm into this, whole discussion in this whole world now because I've been, tasked with, like all brown and black and other minorities, I've been tasked with solving the problem of racism in the US. And so, I'm in here whether I like it or not. I don't get to sit this out. And I have experienced not being able to afford, things. My parents are immigrants, the whole story. Like, I know what it's like to be poor. So, we to not acknowledge that there are those people who are discriminated against by this is another example of systemic racism. And so, I agree with all that has been said. The problem is that once you start bringing that up, people get, defensive. They don't want to hear that everything they've been doing their whole life is based on, this societal hierarchy that benefits them and disadvantages some people. Nobody wants to hear it. But that's what this last couple of years, the conversation has opened up, and we can't shut that can of worms again. So, the question is like, does the GRE perpetuate systemic racism? If it does, then we should remove it from existence unless we think that it has some salvaging quality, which is it helps us pick out the best and the brightest. But, that's a little bit of a question where I still think we have missing data. So, I'm glad that we're having this discussion. It's painful and it's important and we can't avoid it.
Other panelists, do you have any thoughts?
This is sort of my, and actually, and I appreciate everything you said, Q. It is painful and we need to have it. And, this is where, I'm still stumbling and I'm, my attempt to differentiate between like test itself, meaning literally like the number stuff versus the use of it is really, just to be full disclosure, because these conversations will go better if I'm just completely transparent and open, is I believe that the GRE is used in a racist way. I do, intentional or not, is used in a racist way. And I'll just say that I believe that. My attempt to differentiate between using this, it does, I hesitate to bring up the scale again, but I will bring it up because that's just a example we've used. It's sort of like, I think a scale can be used in a racist way as well. I do. And so my attempt to differentiate between, it like the existence. The other thing I'm definitely, this is what's making me pause and reevaluate my attempt to do this. I think the argument that it was built on racism, I think is a really good point, and that might change my attempt to bridge between people who are into the psychometrics of it and say it's not racist, and my belief and I think data that it is used in a racist way. That's my attempt to differentiate between the test is racist versus it's used for racism. And I'm happy to I don't know how much longer we want to spend on this particular point, but I'm actually happy to hear feedback and to tell me that what I'm doing is problematic. That me doing that is actually colluding, etc. Because I will adjust. And I'm somewhat ignorant to that right now because this is more my kind of trying to make the language such that I can have the conversation with people who ultimately believe that the test is not being used in a racist way.
Would you argue that it's only racist against some Black and brown people then, given the disparities that we see?
I think saying just in general that Asians score 3% higher is a big problem, right? Southeast Asians, we know, is very highly underrepresented in higher education versus someone that's from a different area. So just the fact that the stat comes out as 3% Asian is in itself a racist statistic. Just going to throw that out there. That's not why I had my hand raised, but just going to address that. So yes, I do think it is in multiple forms. The fact that we call anyone that's from the general Asia area as Asian is problematic, that they get lumped into one statistic.
right? And this is often used to say, well, if Asians can do it, why can't Black and brown people do it, right? And then we're not talking about hyper-selective immigration policies that bring Asian doctors and professionals into this country whose kids have much more, in their homelands, have much more opportunity than most other people, right? And so like that in itself is, whenever that comes up, it's a subtle wedge that is driven, right? And it diverts the attention away from the problem, which is that this test is upholding a system of white supremacy in our country and within our institutions.
I mean, I think problematically, sorry, Mark, if I'm going in order, but just because I think it plays right here, is we're using these statistics to look at, I think what someone even said before, it's a barrier. You're basing statistics on those that were able to overcome that barrier, right? And regardless of what statistical bias it has or doesn't have, the fact that you are limiting the population to which has access to then contributing to future data analysis means it's by default a skewed data point, right? So that in itself, the fact that it's an equity issue and a barrier for students to read means that in itself, any conclusions you make afterwards is flawed because you're not getting the whole picture. You're only getting the people that were able to overcome that barrier from the beginning. And I think that's a huge issue with this test, regardless of statistically its validity with the limited population you are able to access for those analyses.
So I wanted to go back to Q to ask the question of what should we do? Because I feel like, there's going to be folks that say that other elements of the graduate application are also subject to these biases, whatever we want to call them, in addition to the GRE. So what should we do, Q?
Well, I think that everything has to change, right? Like, so we have to, as professors in our graduate seminars and undergraduate courses, have to kind of think differently about the way that we are grading people, right? And we're assessing ability and learning and things like that. Because then once we think differently about how assessment is being done, then we can think differently about who's being successful, right? Because the metrics for success that that Daniel was talking about, like the things like, people making it through graduate school, that process is full of bias itself, right? And so we're using the same old biased kind of ways of assessing people's success and contributions. Like if we don't redefine what good science looks like, then we can't really get rid of these things like the GREs that are weighing a certain subset of people down. So I think that it's not just about the admissions process for me. I think it's about, for me, really rethinking what higher education looks like. And it starts with us as faculty members in our classroom, right? It starts with us relying on different metrics and different ways of assessing student learning and participation and engagement in our classes, and in the way that we do our research, right? The way that we do research, in which like we have like a faculty member who is like a leader of a lab who's training people, and those people have nothing to contribute except to soak up knowledge and reproduce what you've been taught to produce. Like that whole system is problematic, because then people's lived experiences and people's community wealth, cultural wealth, aren't being used. Right. So I think we have to reconsider how we do research and how we do education in order to tackle this problem. It's not, for me, just a problem with admissions.
Well, Mark, can I jump in here with a follow-up question to what you just asked?
No, I'm sorry, you can't.
Okay.
Just kidding.
So then I'll wait.
That's my colleague, Gary Case. Go ahead.
So I actually had another question I was going to ask, but I'll pause it. I'll pop it in the chat box later on. And I was intrigued by the discussion we're having about how, particularly Q's comments on the GRE is sort of founded upon, racist principles of exclusion. And I was thinking about it, the analogy is IQ testing. If you know that literature, the history of IQ testing is fraught with racist sort of foundations, if you will. In fact, the original Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children was cited in the Larry P.V. Riles case that showed that test initially differentially predicted children of color to be more likely identified as, back then, the term was mentally retarded. But the newest test, the WISC-5, which came out in 2013, I think it was, has among the broadest normative sample of any ability test ever, and does well with intergroup racial and ethnic differences. It's not perfect, but it's far better than the past. If we use the same logic that the GRE was sort of predicated, has a history of being used as a tool of institutional or systematic racism, can the GRE be fixed in other words, in the same way that the IQ tests were fixed in that area? We have a long way to go with IQ testing, but or is the GRE so fundamentally flawed, according to some people, that it's not fixable? We need to look at something else entirely. That's sort of my follow-up question to what Q was saying.
Yeah, opening that up to the panel or anyone else.
I would just want to add in that the foundational principles of intelligence testing began with Binet, and the effort was to tease out the emotionally disturbed from those who just needed more help at school. And those were not racist intentions by any means. And I think the argument that the GRE was designed to, I don't know, just is a product, maybe that it's a product of a society that was white. I could see that as an argument, but I don't think that there was this malevolent intent to keep people out. But clearly I'm not seeing the malevolent intent that other people do.
I don't think that slave owners saw the malevolent intent either in, holding slaves. It's not that people do things knowing exactly why they're doing them. It's that, once you're at the top of a hierarchy, it's very easy to justify staying there. But I don't think that we should argue that because something wasn't done with malevolent intent, that it wasn't the wrong thing to do.
Can I just jump in as, can I jump in, Mark? Just, I don't get to do this often in this position, but I have to raise this particular question just from the standpoint of a university administrator. So when we look at GREs, the question that I have overall, and this is my way I even frame higher education, is that are we gatekeepers or are we a gateway? The GRE often is utilized to be a gatekeeper to the academy. And so when we're looking at it, I'm hearing the term tool. So it is a tool, but for what purpose? So it's a greater question to be asked. So why are we utilizing this tool? Does this tool remain effective? And so those are core questions that we need to ask. The reasons why that I've remained in higher education for 25 years plus is to create opportunities to make this a gateway. And so I examine almost all decisions related to, is it gatekeeper or is it gateway? So that's an ultimate question. And then I think Lucina mentioned this. And look, I don't get to do this often, but let me just share this. What I often tell my students is that systems don't love, systems don't care, systems process people. Systems are created to process and to facilitate interactions and transactions with people. So when we're looking at higher education, it's an admission system. It's meant to process people, not to care about them. In order to do a serious evaluation about the possibilities in the human condition, it's going to take more time. The GRE was meant to facilitate, was also utilized as a tool for the reasons that Q stated. It is clear. So I'm raising this is that it's a fundamental question. Are we being gatekeepers or being a gateway? Are we building walls or are we creating more space? Those are the questions.
I just respond. I appreciate that, being Cersei, I've been accused of being somewhat nihilistic in the past, but I would say in most cases it's a gatekeeper. It's a gatekeeper. I mean, like, just be honest. Like, the GRE is used as a gatekeeping mechanism, and at least in my personal experience at many universities, for being there for many reasons, it's almost exclusively been used as a gatekeeper. It does bring up, just sort of thinking out loud, and yeah, I was looking at the chat, and it's a problem. I don't say that like, oh, I'm proud of it. It's like, my point is that it is a problem. It does bring up, just thinking out loud about what do we do. I'm just, maybe this is too harebrained, but I had the thought just before this call, like, should we be, if we think the GRE predicts something, and we can make the argument that there's a way to make it not be used in a racist way, then do we only use it as the gateway? Do we only accept the scores from students who have low GPAs, and then we pay them to take the GRE, or we pay them and give them time to take it, or something like that? Where in that case, because the thing we haven't said in this call, which gets said a lot, is that there are many people that will say that the only way they got into grad school was their GRE scores. There are many people that say that they had a low GPA, they didn't have research experience, and they didn't know anyone, and they didn't have letters of recommendation, but they had really high GRE scores. So, and that, I mean, that does happen. That would maybe be an example of the gateway. I don't think that personal opinion, I don't think it happens as much as the gatekeeper, but what if we restrict the use of it to the gateway use of it? That could be something that we may be able to do, but this is assuming, again, that the test itself, without all use aside, itself is not, basically discriminating itself, and that's, that's something that's debatable.
So 2 years ago, seems like 10 years ago, because it was before the pandemic, my former student and now colleague Jasmine Moshiri and I presented on this at the APA conference, Pros and Cons of the GRE. And so Jasmine is here and has been holding herself back up until this point on commenting on the discussion. So I wanted to throw it to Jasmine.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Dr. O. I have a few questions, actually, that I'd really like to hear the panel's perspective on, particularly April. For one, I know we keep mentioning that coaching doesn't help with the GRE, but isn't the entire intention of education to be able to test the learnability of your students? Like, aren't we here to learn more and be able to become better at what we do? So why would we ever use a tool that doesn't allow people to get better at it? That just seems very counterintuitive to me. And in addition to that, like, we keep also mentioning that keep equating, I feel like, the other components of the applications that we use in graduate programs. However, every other component of the application directly correlates with a lot of things that you encounter in graduate school. I mean, unless you're taking some kind of certification test or something, how often are you sitting for 4 hours and taking a test like that in graduate school? I mean, the idea is that we're doing a lot of research and we're able to adapt. And I would argue that resilience and those kind of things that you see in more diverse groups are a lot more advantageous than your ability to take a test that apparently you can't get better at. But I just don't think that, I know we keep saying like, okay, there's no better whatever, we don't have another whatever, and it's just as bad as all the other parts of, or just as biased as all the other parts of the application. But the other parts of the application are research, which are so important to graduate school, interviews, which also are going to be important throughout your grad career, your GPA, which is the classes that you take that you took to get into this graduate program. So they directly correlate with what you're learning. But then there's the GRE, which I'm not even sure. I don't know if there's research on that out there, and I should look into it. But how much does it really overlap with the programs? I would argue hardly anything at all. So given that, and given the fact that diversity is so important, as psychologists, we know that having diverse perspectives, I'm a human factors engineer, and I can tell you that I learn every single time from different groups, and that's why we obviously have a diverse demographic in any study that we do. diversity is extremely important to education because, you know, if you disregard a whole group of people, then you're disregarding a whole group perspective and different things that we could learn and different things that we could like elaborate on. And like, why would we add this thing that doesn't even correlate to graduate school as another barrier to diversity if it in any way does that? I'm just curious, like, what your perspective on, I guess the 3 points is, why add another diversity barrier? How much does the test really correlate with graduate school compared to every other part of your application? And lastly, if you can't even get better at the GRE, then why are we using a tool that is exactly the opposite of what the point of school is?
Well, I can try to respond to the comment about the coaching. I mean, I guess the first thought is, you know, why have another barrier? And I think again, the discussion is around what are the alternatives? Are the alternatives actually not also diversity barriers and still allowing programs that have a lot of applicants to select usefully? But I think with coaching, the idea is the idea. It's not that you can't improve. It's that these test prep classes don't do what they, you know, you can advertise, people have gained by as much as X number of points. The issue is that on average, they don't gain very much. They gain by about as much as a student does by engaging in test prep with a book from the library, by going through and saying, what do I do on this test?
I'm going to correct you there, actually, because I've done the research on this, and it shows that the reliability of the GRE is really high, despite taking a class or however you choose to study, even after, like, I had a very low score on the GRE, and I scored top of my class, 4.0 in my graduate program, and I would probably score exactly the same on the GRE, and it is not indicative of anything that I learned or predictive of anything in that way. So if I can't get better at the GRE even after being in graduate school and being the top of my class, scoring straight A's and almost in the top 10% of every single class that I've taken, then what does that say about the GRE and how effective it is?
I'm not sure what you're meaning about test retest stability versus the capacity to change by a few points on average. So I think we're talking about something different.
I'm just saying that across the board, student scores don't change. It's a very reliable test. Good for them for that, as a statistician, I'd say. But like, if that's the case, then why would you use a tool like that in an environment where learning and the ability to get better at things is of the most importance out of anything? Like, isn't that why we go to school? Like, what kind of message are you sending to your students by telling them to take a test that's going to basically say you're stupid and you're not worthy of going to graduate school and there's no way you can get better at it? Is that the message that you're trying to send?
That's not the message I'm trying to send, but I'll let others chime in.
No, I'm just curious though on your perspective on that. Like, how do you feel about the fact that you cannot get better at the test? Like, what is that? Like, every other part of the application can, right? You can be better at interviews, you can be better at doing research, you can, you know, raise your grades, and you can do all those things are things that you are able to improve on. And, you know, you want to give students something that they are unable to improve on. Like, there are statistics that show people take the test at one point and took it 10 years later and still got the same or similar scores. So how do you support something like that?
Sure. Well, I think there are a couple of things that reminds me of. I mean, I understand your frustration with that, right? It's like, why do we use this if we can't improve on it? And I think it is designed to be a standardized test of cognitive ability, of reasoning and analytical potential. And like, it's the GRE scores are strongly correlated with SAT scores. They're strongly correlated with
other standardized tests that you can't really get much better at. But my question is also, so you're saying that you're basically saying that we're measuring like IQ of people before we let them into
it is considered by psychometrician a test that draws strongly on.
When we study cognitive abilities, then why wouldn't we give them actual cognitive tests? I mean, we have like endless access to different ways to measure cognitive abilities that would be important for graduate school. So why wouldn't we use something like that as opposed to something that measures maybe something? I mean, the only thing really, honestly, the stats show is the polarity. So if you get really, really good grades on the test, or really, really low grades, you're gonna do really, really well or really, really bad. And I mean, that's just because of everything we know about biases in research, which is that if you're really good at everything, then you're going to be really good at everything. If you're really bad at everything, you're going to be really bad at everything. People in the middle, actually, there is not much predictivity. So how do we justify using a scale that doesn't even allow people any type of growth? Isn't that almost actually being like ableist? Like, I mean, if you have like a learning disability or anxiety or anything like that also to account, I mean, we're depriving all those type of people from getting into programs because they're unable to take a freaking test that doesn't even measure anything that we would use in graduate school.
So I wanted to get to Matt Laytow, my former student as well. Hello, Matt. And
Hi.
I wanted to get to you before 4, and it's 3:58, which
Yeah, thank you. I'm currently a grad student at Georgetown, and I've actually in my department, I'm one of the people who's wanting to try to remove the GRE as a barrier. But I think there's two things, two kind of questions I wanted. The first one is mostly the pushback from the department. The pushback is basically, if we remove the GRE, obviously we're removing a metric that people can use to evaluate some sort of application. So I know that process is difficult, and that since the GRE has this, systematic equity bias, that they can accommodate for that. And I'm wondering how realistic that is, right? How much can we really accommodate for that bias and manage that bias? And then the second question, I know it's two, but is that basically that in modern research practices is that we're trying to get publications out, we're trying to get research out, and the GRE is really not predictive of time to dissertation. It is very predictive of things like first year GPA, for instance, which I've been assured by all the faculty that grades don't matter and I should be focusing more on research at this point anyways. And I'm just wondering about the value, right? What is the value that this GRE has over other metrics? And, especially if we're considering that people might have to go out of their way to take this test that's $200 and maybe 4 hours out of their way because they don't live in a major city, right?
So I want to open that back up to the panel and kind of just opening things generally now that it's 4 o'clock. Thank you to the panel, by the way. I didn't want to keep you if you couldn't be kept longer than this hour. Before we open it back up to address Matt's question, I wanted to give a quick Zoom round of applause to you guys. Thank you for engaging in this discussion, pro and con, and every issue that exists and we've discussed. So with that said, if the panel needs to exit, you guys can just exit. I will be in touch though. If you don't mind staying, then please do. I'll plan to stick around at least another 20 minutes or so myself. Back to opening it up to address Matt's question.